let's move to making colloidal particles. And like I said in the introduction, is that we're gonna focus in this particular case on making polymeric particles via emulsion polymerization and via mini emulsion polymerization, because it integrates quite nicely with the polymer chemistry modules you've had and some of the surface and interface modules that you've had before. Okay, so this is the topic. What is emulsion polymerization? So let's start to digest this a little bit. Okay, so we've seen before that if we disperse oil droplets in water, we end up with an emulsion. And here's a picture. So I've just got some oil, water, shake it, and then one liquid phase will disperse in the other. Depending obviously on the volumetric ratios of the two, yeah, you could get a phase inversion if you change it. So you either get oil droplets dispersed in water or water droplets dispersed in oil. Yeah? And it swaps over. Doesn't have to be at 50-50. It could be at any volume that you suddenly get a phase inversion and the other phase becomes a continuous phase. So, so if I look at this picture here, I can see that there is two droplets there that touch each other, and there's a little bit of pressure on the left in the picture. Two of those big ones, they touch each other, but they don't fuse. This is kind of weird initially, because if this would be just a pure liquid, and if I want to get rid of my interfacial tension, then you would assume that if these things touch each other, they would fuse into a larger droplet, because the larger droplet, by definition, will have a lower area to volume ratio. So less molecules will touch the water phase, so that would be better for it. And the reason why it doesn't do that in this particular picture is that there are stabilizers present on the surface that prevent droplets from coalescing. So when they touch each other, or when they're about to touch each other, there's a barrier being put in place that prevents this from happening unless I push hard enough, and then they will fuse. So this barrier could be two things. It could be molecules. So it could be, for example, an SDS molecule. Now, if you think of sodium dodecyl sulfate, it's like a C12 chain with a little sulfate group. And if I would have that on a large oil droplet, and another large oil droplet comes, that tiny molecule will get displaced quite quickly, right? The impact of this large droplet would just immediately kick it off. So that would not be a very, very good choice. So I could potentially say, okay, what if I have a larger molecule, like a polymeric molecule, that's amphiphilic in nature? For example, polyvinyl alcohol. Yeah? You have a large hydrophobic backbone, especially, kind of polyethylene type. And then you have all these OH groups that are hydrophilic. Or I pick carboxymethyl cellulose, or cellulose, all these glucose units. And then I make some of them a bit more hydrophobic with a methyl group or an ethyl group, the OH groups. Then I get an amphiphilic polymer material. If I put that on the surface, that's a bit more gooey. So if I bump these things then together, then maybe I have to push harder and I can stabilize them better. So that would be an option. And another option is, okay, let's forget about molecules. What if I put solid particles on that interface? So actually I put colloids on a droplet to keep these droplets, prevent these droplets from merging together. So that's a third barrier that you can put in place that would prevent these two things merging. So you would think that, an emulsion polymerization, okay, I'm going to make a droplet of oil in water, and my oil droplet is a monomer, and then I'm going to disperse this, and then I'm going to polymerize this, and that's what it's called, an emulsion polymerization. Unfortunately, that's not true. That particular process is called a suspension polymerization. And the reason is that when people started doing emulsion polymerizations, they didn't know very much about the mechanism. And so they came up with this word. This is the process, we start up with an emulsion of monomer droplets dispersed in water, in styrene, for example. I add a radical initiator, and I end up with polymer particles dispersed in water, hence the word emulsion polymerization. What they did not know at that time is that the mechanism was way more complex. So if you actually would polymerize monomer droplets dispersed in water, later on people found that that process is called a suspension polymerization. So now the question is, what is an emulsion polymerization if that would not be it? So let's see what we actually do, yeah? And I think all of you guys have done this last year in physical lab. All of you made waterborne paint binder, I think. This year, only a few people, but last year everybody did. So you have to have some knowledge of this, a little bit. So you disperse a water-insoluble monomer, for example, styrene. Could be anything else, right? You know, methyl acrylate, butyl acrylate, methacrylate, vinyl acetate, VOVAS, you name it. You disperse it in water, and then traditionally people used it with the aid of a surfactant. So this was developed in the 1930s, 1940s, yeah, and the most easy surfactant to use, sodium dodecyl sulfate, is most commonly used. And then you just stir the stuff up, and you basically get, obviously, droplets of monomer dispersed in water. And you heat it up, and then you add a water-soluble initiator. With initiator, I mean a component that is able to generate free radicals, and once it has generated a free radical, that radical has to attack the monomer. If it doesn't do that, you won't get a polymer. Yeah, so there's two side conditions to that. So there's a picture here of potassium persulfate, and you can see if you heat that up, the peroxide group in the middle breaks homolytically, and you get two radical species. Now, and then, so you do this polymerization, and if you would stir monomer droplets, how far can you go down? If you shake really hard, you have a good stirrer, you probably get it down to a micron, right? Soap and water, it's like washing up liquid, really. If you do your washing up, you shake, you can kind of see these droplets. If you do your best, you can get it down to a micron. Not lower than that. And you do this reaction, and then you take a picture on your product, and what you'll see is that these particles are way smaller than your original droplets were. So this is initially rather surprising. Yeah? So either the density of polymer is so much larger than the density of monomer that you get a massive volume contraction. Is that true? Well, the density of polystyrene, for example, is 106 relative, and the monomer is 0.909. So you get about 20% volume contraction. So on radius, that would be, whatever, cubic root of that. Yeah? So that would not account for such small particles. So that is out of the window. So that basically means that throughout the process, I have to form another phase. Something is happening that we didn't know initially that produces those small particles rather than polymerizing the large monomer droplets. So let's have a look at this process and put it in a natural context. A brief history, very, very brief history. So polymer dispersions, or a polymer latex, as it's referred to, the reason why it's referred to as latex is because this has been known for centuries and centuries and centuries. Some plants, if you cut them open, will have this white fluid that seeps out. And this white fluid is natural latex. And so there's some rubber trees, which they grow in Asia, and there's some other trees, quite a bunch of trees actually on plants, that have got this white sticky fluid. And then if you analyze this, then, so here you see a picture of tapping this stuff off of a tree, you end up with this white fluid. You can make amazing materials of this. And the people that were first with this, 1600 before Christ, right? So we're going way back to the Mesoamericans who predict that the world is going to end, what, the 21st of December this year, I guess. So, but anyway, years ago, they invented a football already, they had chewing gum, they had protective rubber boots and clothing, protecting you from getting wet. So this is not a recent invention, this is actually really old. It's a very, very nice paper in Science about this, about 12 years ago. So if you're interested in the history of this, look up the reference and read it. So how did they do this? Well, they basically extracted this white fluid from the tree just by cutting the tree, and then or from another plant. And what they didn't know at the time was that it basically was just polyisoprene. Yeah. And what they then did is that they mixed this with all kinds of other herby ingredients, and that basically changed the acidity of the mixture, which coagulated the latex effectively. And then what they did is that they heated it up. And what they didn't know was that there was a pendant double bond there that if you heat it up would crosslink, which means effectively they made rubber. Yeah? And this is way before Christ. And then obviously that was forgotten. And then this guy reinvents rubber again. Yeah. So 1839. You might have heard of the guy called Charles Goodyear tires. Yeah. So he basically took the rubber, but what he did is that he vulcanized it. So he reacted it with sulfur in order to cross-link it. So credit to him, he came up with a slightly better cross-linking process than that messy ball that you had there before. Yeah. And then from that, you had the breakthrough of the pneumatic tire. Interesting thing is that sometimes people discover something and people completely forgot about it. Yeah, as in rubber, Mesoamericans, this guy files a patent. So the clever thing is to file a patent, because then you own the rights. So Thomson invented the tire, but Dunlop copied it. Dunlop got rich. Nobody knows Thomson. So that's how to do commercial science. So the interesting thing is that, so synthetic rubber from these latex trees, that was kind of interesting, but the not so interesting bit was that it was kind of messy. You had to, go about with sulfur, which is not very nice. And then some people were allergic to this kind of stuff. People are still allergic to this kind of stuff. So if you, for example, buy condoms, yeah, a lot of them are made from natural rubber. Yeah, and what they do, they dip coat it, so they have basically just a preformed object, and they dip it in, heat it up a bit, and there you go. There's your condom. The gloves are made the same way, also via dip coating. So you can do this with natural rubber, but there's some stuff in there. Some people get a skin rash, so there was a drive for synthetic rubber towards this. And this drive came, 1920s. 1930s, especially in the 1930s when people started to accept that polymer molecules existed. Before that, there was a massive battle between the organic chemists and the polymer chemists. Obviously, polymer chemists won, and it was kind of logical that you could make synthetic material. So then there was a massive drive to do this via emulsion polymerization, and why? Is because people managed to make butadiene, people managed to make isoprene, people managed to isolate styrene. And if you put these things together in one pot, you end up with one giant rubbery mess. So they had to come up with something different. And their initial process was, well, what if we just disperse this as droplets under pressure, obviously, because butadiene is a gas at room temperature. Then we could polymerize the droplets and then coagulate the droplets, and then we have the same thing as natural rubber. So, and the clever thing is that Harkins, Smith, and Ewart, those three, worked through this through World War II and published it in 1948, actually. And the clever thing was that they also did some experiments with pure styrene, pure out of luck in a way. And as a result of that, they suddenly realized, hey, something weird is going on. We're getting these really small particles that we didn't predict. So the name emulsion polymerization, in a way, is the wrong name, but since we've called it emulsion polymerization, let's stick with the name and try to understand a little bit better what would happen. So, and then That was done in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and then from 1970 to about the year 2000, people really started to look into detail on how this process worked and managed to iron out most of the issues that basically could fully explain this process. Okay, so what are the advantages and the disadvantages of emulsion polymerization? Well, the advantage is, one is a high heat capacity of water. Why would that be advantageous? Why would a high heat capacity of water be good? Who has got an idea? Yes. So polymerization, exothermic reaction, in order to absorb that, not to blow up your reactor basically, yeah, the heat capacity of water is pretty high, so the temperature rises relatively slowly. Good thing. Good tick box. Okay. High rate of polymerization in comparison to the equivalent bulk process. This is interesting. For example, an emulsion polymerization of styrene typically takes between 3 and 4 hours, depends a little bit on conditions, but the equivalent bulk polymerization takes way over 24 hours. That's good. It's way faster. Why is it faster? We'll come back to that later. Another thing, we can make very high molecular weights. With bulk polymerization, styrene, 150,000, roughly it really, can't go much higher. Emulsion polymerization, 1 million, not a problem. Higher molecular weights could be more mechanically robust materials, so could be interesting. And obviously, if you want lower molecular weight, you just add a chain transfer agent and you can make the low stuff. So that's good. We have a low overall viscosity. If I would polymerize styrene in bulk, I get really, really long chains, and I'll get more viscous and more viscous and more viscous until it gets so viscous that I can't stir anymore, and I have a massive problem. Here, I just make ping pong balls, tiny little ping pong balls in water, and viscosity stays relatively low. We'll come back to viscosity later. We can go to really high conversions. Organic chemists are happy with 10% yield. We're not even happy if it's 99. It has to be 99.999. Yeah? Because otherwise you can't sell it. You can't have ppm levels of styrene in here, because, and then use it for food packaging or something, because people won't be very happy with it. That brings me to the next point, which is low VOC, low volatile organic content, as in no remainder amounts of monomer or other stuff left. And a cool thing is, the product is particles dispersed in water. That's nice. Now the negative points. You have to use additives. You have to use some surfactants, there's some water-soluble oligomers, you need some buffer material. That's not the material you might want to be after. And the negative thing is, the products are particles. This is both positive and negative. And the reason is, sometimes you might want to have particles for your application, sometimes you don't care. You're only interested in the bulk material. So it can be both positive or negative.